Hello, I'm Caldwell, and this is On the Money, a weekly look how to get the best out of your savings and investments. So in this episode, we're covering what was in and what was not in Chancellor Rachel Reeves's briefcase when she stepped up to deliver the budget, which was the Labour Party's first in 14 years. We're recording this episode shortly after the budget in order for the podcast to be published as usual on a Thursday, so please do bear that in mind when you're listening, as events can of course change. Joining me to offer his expert insight is Craig Rickman, Interactive Investor's personal finance editor. So in total, £40 billion of tax rises were announced, which I've seen some people suggest is the biggest for a budget since John Major's Black Wednesday budget. Labour promised in its manifesto that it wouldn't increase taxes on working people in respect of income tax, national insurance or VAT. That promise has been kept. Instead, what has been announced, which was widely speculated ahead of the budget, is that employers will pay more in national insurance, a move that will raise £25 billion for the government. Craig, let's start off with this. Could you run through the details?
Yeah, sure. So, this was a rumour that emerged on Friday, just before the weekend, and it has turned out to be true. So the main rate of employer national insurance will rise from 13.8% to 15%, and the secondary threshold, which is the level which employers start paying national insurance on employees' income, will fall from £9,100 to £5,000. And yet this is expected to raise £25 billion a year, and these changes will take effect from the 6th of April next year. And
of course, while if you're an employee, you're not going to have a change in your payslip when you next receive one. But over time, this move to increase NI for employers, what it could do is it could lead employers to reduce headcount. It could lead them to not increase wages by as much as they may have done. And it could also lead to those that do pay bonuses to be less generous with bonuses in order to make up for the fact that they are now going to be paying more in national insurance.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of stoked this debate around, what's a working person. So that's sort of one side to it. The other is that higher national insurance rates isn't going to just hurt those or affect those companies which are sort of vast and have lots and lots of employees. It will affect them of all shapes and sizes. So even those with, a small number of staff, they will be affected, or freelancers and contractors as well, because it means that the amount of salary that they can draw without paying national insurance will fall from 9,100 to 5,000. So, lots and lots of businesses and indeed individuals will be affected by this.
Let's now move on to pensions. So, as is part of the course in the run-up to any budget, there's always plenty of speculation about potential changes to pensions. As usual, there was some speculation that there might be changes to pensions tax relief. There's always been this idea floated about that pensions tax relief might be moved to a single rate. However, there was no announcement for this, so that remains the same. There was also some speculation that the tax-free cash available for those taking advantage of the pension freedoms, that you can take 25%, that percentage might be lowered. That's not happened. And there's also speculation that the maximum amount that you can take would be lowered to £100,000. Again, this didn't happen, and that remains at £268,275. However, one change that will come into force from 2027 is that pensions will come into inheritance tax. Craig, could you talk us through this? And do you think pensions may be used less now for passing wealth to the next generation?
Yes, I think it's fair to say that, from what we can assume, pensions can still be left to younger generations, younger family members, but they may pay inheritance tax on receiving it. So it clearly makes them, or will make them, less attractive. This was a big move, a big policy. The IHT benefits exemption within pensions is quite long-standing. And so, any change here is going to affect quite a lot of people, especially those who have used pensions for the IHT saving benefits. So it's a big change. So what we can sort of presume that this means is that your pension pot will form part of your estate on death, and anything above your tax-free allowances that you don't leave to a spouse or civil partner, so we can assume that exemption will remain, will be taxed at 40%. And given some of the other changes to IHT, which we're going to come on to, it could be a painful one for people's painful budgets.
So let's talk through those two other changes to inheritance tax. There were two announcements. The first of those is that the freeze on inheritance tax thresholds has been extended by 2 years to 2030. So what this means is that the first £325,000 of any estate can be inherited tax-free. And then this then rises to £500,000 if the estate includes a residence that is passed on to direct descendants. The other change that was announced, of which there was plenty of speculation that this may happen, is that AIM shares are no longer inheritance tax-free. Craig, could you talk us through what will be changed here?
Yeah, I'll briefly cover this. So you will now only get 50% relief on eligible shares on AIM that you hold for 2 years instead of 100% relief. And the government reckons this will only affect around 0.3% of estates every year. But for those who are affected, the change will be considerable.
Interestingly, though, the AIM market, the FTSE AIM All-Share Index, rallied in response to when this was announced. It ended the day up 4%. And I think the reason behind this was that this was a bit of a relief rally for the market. I think there was a lot of fears that the IHT sweetener for AIM shares, if they're held for 2 years, would be completely removed. So I think a lot of investors welcomed the fact that yes, it has changed and it's not as generous as it was previously, but it hasn't been completely taken away. And in response, the market went up.
Yeah, and so there were also some significant changes to business relief and agricultural relief. So there were sort of rumours around this in the lead up to the budget. So in some cases, these will offer 100% relief from inheritance tax with no cap, but this will change from April 2026. So they remain 100% tax-free or inheritance tax-free for the first 1 million of any assets passed down, but 50% relief will now be applied to anything above. The Chancellor said that 3/4 of claims will be unaffected by the changes, but for those who are, it may prompt a rethink to their succession planning strategies, as whoever inherits a farm or inherits a business may now be hit with a sort of a fairly large bill from HMRC, which could affect, their future decisions with that business. They still have sort of 18 months to work things out, but I think for those impacted here, they'll be looking to start the planning process as soon as possible to see how they can sort of protect themselves and protect the future of either their farms or businesses in light of this tax change.
So overall then, there were 3 changes to inheritance tax rather than 2, as I just mentioned.
Yeah, so there was an extra one, yeah.
Let's now move on to capital gains tax. So potential increases to capital gains tax dominated the rumour mill in the run-up to this budget. And there have been changes which, by the time you listen to this podcast, have already taken effect. So the rates payable on the sales of shares for basic rate taxpayers have been increased from 10% to 18%. And for higher rate taxpayers, they've been increased from 20% to 24%. Of course, if you're an investor and you've got money that is not in tax-friendly wrappers like ISAs and SIPs, this is not good news. However, one saving grace is that it could have been a lot worse. There were a lot of rumours in the run-up to the budget that capital gains taxes would be equalised with income taxes, and this has not happened.
Yes, hikes to capital gains tax have dominated the rumour mill in the past few months. So there is a sense that it could have been worse, but it's still not ideal either. Some reports suggested it might be equalised with income tax rates, which would have meant that CGT rates effectively double. And apparently, a couple of weeks ago, some reports suggested that Labour was testing rates between 33% and 39%. So neither of those came to pass. But it's, as you say, it still means that investors with holdings outside of tax wrappers will pay more capital gains tax from now on.
And of course, as well as those rates going up, the capital gains tax allowance has been whittled away heavily over the past couple of years. The current amount that you can use towards the allowance is £3,000. But a year, in the previous tax year, it was £6,000. And prior to that, it was £12,300. So, it's become less generous. And now investors are going to be paying more tax as well. So it is a double whammy of bad news. And it emphasises the importance of using tax-free wrappers if you're not utilising the full allowance for ISAs and SIPs. That's a nice segue for me to move on to ISAs. So it wasn't announced during the Chancellor's speech, but it was in the documents following the statement, the announcement that the ISA allowance will be frozen until 2030. So it will remain at £20,000 a year until then. And the junior ISA will also remain the same at £9,000 a year. And that's the same also for child trust funds. And the £4,000 lifetime ISA will also remain the same until then, until the 5th of April 2030. I mean, on the one hand, my take on this is that it's good news for investors in the respect that it provides clarity that the ISA allowance is not going to be cut or meddled with. There was speculation that there might be a lower ISA allowance going forward. And there was also some speculation that there might be a lifetime cap on ISAs introduced. To me, both those things are probably off the table now, given that they've decided to freeze the annual subscription limits for 6 years. However, for those that can maximise the ISA allowance, of course, the majority of investors can't do this, but around 15% of ISA investors can maximise the allowance. They may have been hoping that the government reverted back to the days of the annual allowance increasing in line with inflation, but it appears that that is not going to happen. What were your thoughts on this being sort of buried in the minutes, Craig?
Yeah, I mean, the same as you. I think it's a shame that they've that the ISA allowance is going to remain frozen because it's already been frozen. I'm not sure exactly. I think since 2017, 20,000 allowance. So that would mean 13 years of the ISA limit remaining at £20,000. And as you say, you'd hope that it ticks up every year. Frozen thresholds and limits has been a theme for the past few years. And that's obviously going to carry on. But I think one would hope, especially, the British ISA has been scrapped. It was controversial anyway. But I think there might have been some hope that if they're scrapping the British ISA and there's £5,000 that some investors might have been hoping to get, or an extra £5,000, then there may have been some hope that they may consider, that they, as in the government, may consider moving that over to the standard ISA allowance. So I personally think it's a bit of a shame that that's been removed from the table.
So Craig, I think we've covered off the main changes that impact people's personal finances. Have you got any concluding thoughts on your overall assessment of the budget?
Yeah, I think some of us were sort of hoping that the government may scrap stamp duty on UK shares, but that didn't come to pass. But I think other than that, the changes today are going to affect quite a lot of people, quite a lot of investors, and it's going to affect their future plans, especially the stuff around inheritance tax. I think inheritance tax with pensions. So I think once the dust has settled, it's a timely point to have a look at your plans and see how the changes might affect you, and see if there's anything that you need to rejig in your strategy so that things work for you.
Well, thanks to Craig, and thank you for listening to this episode of On the Money. If you enjoyed it, please follow the show in your podcast app and do tell a friend about it. If you get a chance, leave us a review or a rating in your podcast app too. You can join the conversation, ask questions and tell us what you'd like us to talk about via email on otm@ii.co.uk. And in the meantime, you can find more information and practical pointers on how to get the most out of your investments on the Interactive Investor website, which is ii.co.uk. And I'll see you next week.